All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Resident Skeptics. Our first virtual, not our first virtual podcast, but our first virtual podcast with an awesome guest. We have Lauren Johnson, who is a church coordinator for Turning Point Faith at Freedom House Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're so excited to have her on because one, we just think that she's awesome, but two, we think she has some really unique perspectives, especially from her role that she's in. So, first off, Lauren, thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it. And before we get into kind of the meat of our conversation, can you just tell us a little bit about your role and also a little bit about Turning Point Faith?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad that I'm here. So, Turning Point Faith is basically an initiative from the mother company Turning Point USA with Charlie Kirk. And it's basically specifically targeting the churches across America because we believe that the Christians in America have been lacking in their duty to vote and get involved politically in their local communities. And so it's basically engaging and empowering the local church to kind of step in and take back what's rightfully ours and fight for what we believe in and what biblical values we stand for. And then my role for Turning Point Faith at Freedom House is I coordinate with the church and kind of get our members involved. We have monthly events, we call them Freedom Nights, where we have awesome speakers out to kind of encourage everyone in the congregation. And then starting in the fall, we're going to do some classes, some biblical citizenship classes, and just really get people engaged. Yeah, so that's my role for right now. I coordinate a lot of events and just kind of speak to everybody about what they can do in our community.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And so I guess the real question for you, and Connor, just jump in anytime, but
Oh yeah.
what made you decide to do this? What made you decide to be a church coordinator? What made you decide to become more politically active? Like, were you politically active before this? Like, just talk to us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story because, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree that when COVID happened, we became more politically aware and active
A
just
little bit.
because, yeah, because that, infiltrated our everyday lives. And you saw just how much the government had control over what you do, what you don't do, what you can do in your life. So for me, it was definitely COVID, but I was raised in a Christian conservative household. So I've kind of always had those values. But it really wasn't until COVID and recently that they became my values. And I just really kind of took to heart all of the things that we stand for as conservatives. And so in 2020, I went to the Student Action Summit with Turning Point USA kind of last minute. And I felt a clear calling from God to work for them. But it was funny, I didn't end up working for them until now with Turning Point Faith. So pretty cool that I get to work at my church and then also for Turning Point USA.
That's a nice little combo there. You get to stay at your church, but also work for another organization.
Exactly,
That's
right.
nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was going to ask how that partnership works out with your church and with Turning Point USA. So, I'm guessing there are other churches similar to yours
Mm-hmm.
that partner with them.
Yes, it's a new initiative. I think that they're going to be releasing some more information and some more details about how all of it's working next year. But for right now, we have, I think, oh gosh, I don't know how many, but there are churches all across the country that are partnered with Turning Point Faith. And the way it works is we just have regional faith representatives who kind of coordinate, are the in between for us and Turning Point Faith headquarters in Phoenix, and just basically help us find events that we can table at, rallies we can be a part of, speakers to bring out, just kind of all of that. Yeah.
Have you got to go to any of those events yet?
What kind of events?
Any type of rallies, or I mean, we know Charlie Kirk has come around speaking
Mm-hmm.
fairly frequently, I think, in the Charlotte area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But have there been any like rally type stuff that's been going on?
We have a few exciting things planned for the fall. some rallies in Charlotte, and then also just like local events that we're going to be able to be a part of and get involved with. Mainly the events that we're involved with are the ones that we have at Freedom House that we have monthly. So last month we had Stephen Davis out, and then this coming in September we'll have David Harris Jr., which is going to be really exciting. So I love whenever we have those people out. Yeah.
And it seems like in your role, like, do you get to meet some pretty interesting people?
Yeah, for sure. I love it because we always go to lunch with them before the event that night. And so we'll get to kind of pick their brain on a couple of things and just hear what they have to say. And it's cool to get to know them as people as well, and then see what they stand for politically and kind of make those connections as to why. So I think it's a really cool opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, well, because you have these specific people, like, and a lot of people live online, right? And so, you take somebody like I guess like Charlie Kirk or Alveda King, a couple of people that you guys have had come over, and they typically get smeared as something that is surely bad, white supremacist,
Right.
Christian nationalist, name something. And then you kind of get a chance to just see them in person. And of course, they're humans and they have their flaws, and they're Republicans and Democrats are not, they're both not perfect. But you get to kind of see them like as just humans, and you actually just get to talk to them and have them kind of explain their side. That must be a little bit, I don't know, maybe a bit eye-opening. Maybe that's just me projecting that, but I mean, did that kind of happen for you where you're like, wow, it's just so different to see them in person?
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I think one of the coolest experiences for me, and I kind of, at the beginning, I was volunteering because I interned at Freedom House. And so I was able to volunteer for our chapter at Turning Point Faith, or with Turning Point Faith. And so I kind of tagged along with the team, going to lunch with everybody. But I mean, just sitting and soaking in everything that they say. We had Seth Gruber out, who is the abortion activist. And he, or not abortion, pro-life activist. Let me make that clear.
I thought you meant anti-abortion there.
I understood, but yeah.
Pro-life.
Okay, I've done I've done the same thing. Like when I'm talking, normally I'm like, abortion act. I'm like, no, I mean pro-life. No. Yeah, you're good.
Especially coming from a church, pro-life for sure.
Yeah.
But no, he just the way that he talks, and he memorizes passages of books, which is crazy. And so we got to sit down at lunch with him and just soak everything in, and it is cool because you see them as they're talking to their wives on the side or their husbands, and like they're just talking about life, but they have so much wisdom that they've learned from doing this full time for so long that you can't help but learn from them.
Who's been the most interesting one you've gotten to meet and observe?
I think honestly, probably I would say Seth Gruber, just because I felt like standing in the room with him, I was getting smarter. Stephen Davis was also really cool, just because he was a normal person and just was very on fire. You would talk about anything and he would get really excited to talk to you. And so I love when that happens and you get that interaction.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Connor, were you going to say something?
Nope, you're good.
All right, awesome. Well, I mean, so you talked a little bit with your role about like, hey, we're trying to get churches involved. So that must mean that there is something going wrong in America, at least, where we've heard before. I'm sure for our audience at home, you see on your social media feed of Christians, and they're like, listen, they're like, I'm Christian, but I'm not at all political. All right, I'm sure Lauren has heard this. I'm sure you all have heard this. Connor has heard this. And so I guess I just want to hear your take on this when Christians say, I'm not political, and then we have a lot of issues going on in our culture that very much demand a response from Christians according to their faith, especially regarding abortion, and in a little bit more of what feels like a more indirect way of transgenderism, specifically in children. And I like to call it body mutilation because I think that is a more accurate description of what is happening there. just talk to us a little bit about that and your thoughts on Christians and politics, why they're not getting involved, how they should be getting involved. Just talk to us about your perspective.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I look at it as, I mean, when Christians say, or anyone says, the church should not get involved with politics, I think there's basically, I've thought about this a lot, so I have my argument all broken down. I think there are basically two main flaws in what they believe. At that point, if you say the church should not get involved in politics, you're basically saying, or you're not political as a Christian, you're basically saying that the church and politics are on the same level, they're on the same playing field, and therefore they should not influence one another. When I think as Christians, we have to be very intentional about believing that the church is above every other institution. Governmental or non-governmental, I think that the church is above everything. It should influence that. So that's why the church should influence politics, and why we have a duty to get involved in politics, because we as the church are meant to be influencing it. The other flaw, I think, in that thinking is, I mean, it's easy to see now that these aren't just political issues. I mean, they're biblical issues. Like you said, with abortion, whether a baby lives or dies is a biblical issue. And we have a duty to have a say in that and to use our voice, the voice that we have through the freedoms we have in this country, to fight for our biblical values. I also think that there's a lot of spiritual warfare going on. And pastors talk about this all the time if they're involved in the political realm, that this is no longer, a battle between Democrats and Republicans. It's good and evil, and we see that playing out in transgenderism and just the demonic radicalism of the dynamic that Christ created for our world. So there's definitely a lot of that thinking going around. Just, I think people are scared as well. It's scary to kind of step into a world that feels so overwhelming and so many people know more than you do, or just a lot to understand. And I get that totally. I understand. I think that a lot of people don't understand, though, is that every little bit helps. Every little bit makes a difference. I mean, one vote makes a difference. Going to one rally, going to one event, and learning a little bit, reading a little bit of history, like, these are just things that I think everyone can do, and you don't have to give away all of your time or all of your energy just to start getting involved and, see where you fit in that.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, where, where the church and the politics, they kind of meet to a certain extent. There's kind of an interlapping. I think, and maybe this is just me, where I feel like it's almost a cop out from some believers to say, I just want to be in my church. I don't want to get involved in any way
Yeah.
in politics. Sometimes that's what I feel like is going on. And I think that, I think there's, like you said, there's a lot of fear, where I think we kind of fear man a little bit more than we fear God, where, this happens more with the left than it does with the right. It'll happen with some people on the right, but that's always very unfortunate when that happens. But on the left, there's a lot of name calling, like, it's a lot of overgeneralizations. Well, if you're not for Black Lives Matter, then you have to be, a racist. If you're not for abortion, you must absolutely hate women. And then they just go into these very broad generalizations, and you think there's no way that this will catch on. And sure enough, it totally does. And so you just feel like you're being bullied into silence. And so in your brain, you try to find a way to justify, maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe this isn't really my place. When I think that you're right, where if we just have one person after another deciding that they're going to say something and be bold, that's a good amount of people
Mm-hmm.
in one area. And so your voice, the collective voice, does make a difference, but that collective voice is built up of individual people.
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting, too, to point out to people that, if they say they don't believe that, aside from abortion and some of the more obvious biblical issues of our time, if they say that there's really no political issue they should get involved in, I like to point out that, the left, and the radical left particularly, takes the things that God has created for our good and twists them. And I think we say at our church all the time that Satan can only create parodies of what God intended at the beginning. So we have, man and woman, and then we have man, woman, and 74, 75 other genders on this side. And little boys can become girls if they want to, and all this crazy stuff. And you can just point out and be like, they're taking what the Lord has created and making it something demonic and something it was never meant to be. And so I think that's an easy way to be like, yes, the Bible is being taken and twisted, and that means we have to stand up and fight for the truth.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. Connor, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a hard time trying to find where the boundary is of getting involved. So do they just get involved at the local level? Do they go run for office? And it's almost, I think being in politics now has the same stigma as being a lawyer, where you just feel like no matter what, you're probably going to end up compromising your beliefs, because it just seems to be such an underground kind of slimy profession. You take a favor here, you take a favor there, just so you can get that platform. And maybe at the moment it's a good thing, but down the road you just kind of end up being ensnared to everybody else. And I think a lot of Christians' hesitancy is to wade into those muddy waters, because you really don't know what you're going to get in that world. And I liken it to being a lawyer, just because the lawyers have to defend or prosecute for crooked people all the time. And that's something that I've always wondered, and if I can ever talk to a Christian lawyer about that, I'm really curious, because it's a really hard position, a really hard job to take. And I just wonder if it might be something similar for politicians, because they do have a very negative connotation to their profession at this point. It's not that it's undeserving either. I think it's well deserved.
Right. Yeah.
But what would you say to the Christians that are hesitant, we'll say, to just get involved at the local level, to understand who their sheriff is, their mayor, anybody else that's running around for the local office? What would you say to them that are hesitant about getting involved?
Well, I think that on the local level, it's honestly, you see the people that your actions are affecting, and you see your community, your neighbors, your friends, your family that would be affected if, this person was in office versus this person. And I understand it's daunting and it's hard to keep up with everything that goes on and all the elections and people that are running. I think that we have the power of the internet now, though. So you can't necessarily make the excuse that you didn't know or you don't know. You have all the information at your hands as far as elections go, and you can really do your research for that. I think locally, especially here in Charlotte, just getting involved with something like Turning Point Faith, so that it's not just you're not alone. I think that's one of the hardest parts of being a Christian conservative in a community. It's very easy to feel like you're alone and you're the only one who believes what you believe and votes the way you do. So I think just finding a community of people, whether it's Turning Point Faith or friends and family that believe the same things, or just getting connected with something like that, so that you're not alone and you have those people to bounce things off of, I think really important.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I think you froze for a second, but I think we're good now. Okay,
Can you
awesome.
say that again?
It's okay. It happens. So kind of going back a little bit to church and politics, and kind of going in with Connor's point, like, we understand that, a good thing can get perverted, right? We want churches to be at a certain level involved in politics. And my question for you is, where is the line there? Is there a point where a church is too political or not political enough? What is your thought process on that?
Yeah, I think at this point in time, with everything that's going on around us, churches that don't speak up at all are not biblical. That's what I believe. Churches that won't say they believe one thing or the other, or that their people should do something. I think that they're lacking courage, and because it does take a lot of courage, especially to speak that from the pulpit. I know firsthand our pastors have to be very courageous at Freedom House to say the things they do on platform. But I would definitely say that we also have the opposite side of that, where we have churches that have the transgender flag outside, waving outside, in the courtyard, and like have the love is love outside. We had that a lot in Charlotte, in like the Charlotte city.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
yeah. So I think that the Bible so easily gets twisted. I mean, people use I don't know what verse it is, but it's like, love your neighbor, and people use that as, we should love and accept everyone and not throw them out or tell them we don't agree with them. And so I think that getting involved politically takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of the ability to kind of speak up and be like, we do love you, but we're not going to embrace or accept your lifestyle here.
Yeah.
So I think either way, it takes a lot of courage, but I definitely see too many examples of churches that are just not doing a single thing. And I think that the pastors that are meant to be shepherding their flocks and leading those people in, fighting for what they believe, I think they're going to feel the retribution for that. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
I think oh, sorry, Jordan.
No, go ahead.
You covered pretty well the churches that are not active enough. Now, where do you think, I think Jordan posed this one initially, but where do you think church can go too far in politics? At what point are they involved too much?
I haven't really thought about that. That's an interesting question, because I mean, in my experience, we've had at Freedom House, we've had political candidates up on stage praying for them and kind of extending our hands and just praying for our country. I think we have prayer times where we pray intentionally about the issues that are going on in our country.
Mm-hmm.
I would say on the spectrum, our churches, and I work with a few other church coordinators across the country, and our churches are at the forefront of the fight. I mean, our pastors say all the time that we're the spearhead, and we often get hit the hardest because we're the loudest and the most involved. I don't know. I would say for me right now, thinking about it, I would say that the church should be the primary influencer of politics, and therefore should be the most politically involved of any institution in the country.
Yeah, and I think there is a point, I think, at least in politics, and I think it's something that we have to be careful about, is we stand up. I say this all the time, is that and I think you'd probably end up saying the same, is that you're a Christian first, right? And you're a conservative after that.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that acknowledgement, to me at least, that I think that the Democrats are pretty corrupt overall. I think, and I do make a big distinction between like radical left and liberal, because I think liberals, you can have a more reasonable conversation with a liberal. With a leftist, forget it. There's really, it's like arguing with a fool. There's really no point. And then understanding too, and I was talking to some people that are a bit more intimately involved. I was actually actually interviewed a candidate for the NC, I think for the NC House, and I won't say his name, but I talked with him, and he's running as a Republican, and there's just a lot of stuff behind the scenes that people don't see. And I was just kind of amazed. I was like, wow. And so basically saying that there can be a level of corruption on Republican side too, probably not in the same way, probably a little less, but I'm not an expert. I can't speak to that. But as a Christian, I'm like, okay, if I look at a candidate and I say, all right, I think I agree mostly with what they have to say, and just essentially being honest about Republicans and saying, listen, I tend to lean this way because they tend to get closest to my values. But I could never there are some Republican, and you know of them too. We can think of a couple right here on the spot that we wouldn't necessarily put our money behind or put our words behind, if that makes sense. It's kind of like finding this balance of Christian first, and if there's a Republican that happens to really line up the best with these beliefs, good stuff.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and and so it's, for me, it's like finding that careful balance of, I don't want people to see me as a conservative first. I want people to see me
Yes.
as a Christian first and then a conservative. And so it's about, on a personal level, like finding that balance.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I've struggled with it myself, by the way, where I've been like, sometimes I feel like all the things I post about are conservative stuff and never like anything that talks about Jesus and the love of Christ and his graciousness. And I kind of went on a tangent there, but does that make sense at all?
No, that's exactly right. I think it all boils down to whether you're thinking about it from a big capital C church perspective or on an individual level. Like, who is your God? Who is priority one in your life? Who are you essentially praying to? Is it God or is it the government? And I think that, to your point, Connor, that can be crossing the line for a church if the government is the save all, the solution, the quick fix, and not God. And yeah.
And I think even just to continue that point, I think even propping the Republican Party up itself, because
Right.
I met a lot of Christians that have done that, where they're just like, basically anything red, I'm going that way. It's like, look,
Right.
there might be a day that comes where there's an issue that comes up, and you biblically shouldn't be agreeing with them on this, and you're going to have to vote the other direction.
Yep.
I don't think that issues come up in my lifetime, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, no, and I think Jordan said it best. Like, you vote for who aligns with your values, and it doesn't have to be a Republican, and it doesn't have to be a Democrat. It's whoever believes what you believe in will stand up for that in the best way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the great things about Turning Point is that they do try to get you informed about all the candidates, and we covered a segment I think earlier this year where, I'm trying to remember which state it was. I want to say it was Connecticut, but there was a transgender Satanist, something else, that got elected as a Republican because people were uninformed and they just voted red. And this person, they didn't win, but they were in the running, and it was close. So it was just like, oh, like, we elected to represent, we you got elected in our area to represent, and you went on to continue this, and people were just so upset afterwards. It's like, how dare you? And just like, what do you think you're doing voting when you don't know
Exactly.
who you're voting for?
Exactly.
And it's like, I've unfortunately been that person in the past where it's just like, all right, I'm just going to vote red all the way down. I have no idea who I cast a vote for, that I would probably retract if I could go back and change my vote.
I think a lot of people forget too the way that politics is supposed to work. Probably, like you said, Connor, about how it just feels yucky getting involved in that political world at all. But I mean, our politicians are supposed to represent us as the people. And so just voting red or just voting blue because it's what you've always done or because it's what your family does or anything like that, it basically takes away your power as a citizen of that county or of that state or of America itself to say, I want you to represent me because you believe what I believe, or, not just because you're red or blue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. No, that's a really important point where there's kind of like a level of tribalism that can come with if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat. And I'm sad to say, I think both sides of the political aisle can do this, where I think you made an excellent point that I think is so simple but so profound, is that they represent us. So vote for people that represent your values, right?
Right.
It's that simple. So don't just vote for them because they're red and just assume that they support your values, because even with Republicans, they're starting to become, and tell me what you think about this. I know I didn't tell you we were going to talk about this, but whatever. I'm just gonna lay it out there and be like, I feel like there's two different types of Republicans that we're starting to see. Like, there's the very and I hate to even say it like this, but I think Trump led the way for some more bold Republicans, where I think in the past Republicans have been kind of doormats at certain points, where anytime they got power, they would just kind of do nothing with it, and they would just
Mhm.
Yeah.
like sit on it, and you're like, what are you doing? And I'm sad to say, I think there are still Republicans in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, even in recent history, like even the past couple weeks, that have voted really poorly on some bills. And I don't.
Yep.
It's like they shoot themselves in the foot. Can you just talk about? Do you feel like there's like two different types of Republicans that we are seeing here in the United States?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think for me, the thing about Trump is very true because I mean, the Democrats have pretty much always been the loudest ones in the room. And all of
Mhm.
a sudden you have this brash businessman who is not going to kowtow to any institution or anyone. And he basically led the way for a lot of excuse me, for a lot of Republicans to feel the courage to do the same thing. So you have the loud Texas type, waving the flags, have their gun on their hip type people. And then you definitely have the other side, which is just kind of like we've talked about, a little bit more intimidated, and I think, in my opinion, just a little bit more isolated from all the information and from fellow conservatives. I think also there's a line between, especially now, I mean, the word rhino didn't come out of nowhere. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
and so I think there's a line between Republicans and conservatives at this point too, because we do have a lot of Republican representatives that don't stand up for the things that we believe and value in the Bible. And so you almost have to make that distinction as well for yourself, who believes in Republican values and things, but then also who believes in biblical values.
Mhm.
Yeah, the biblical values there is really key, and I think that's the hardest thing, where I think we have Republicans that have good values but are not Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of, and Connor and I have had this debate multiple times of where the line is of inserting religion into government. And I think the founding fathers had it right, where I don't think they weren't all Christians. Um, but they did have a great respect for Christian
Mm-hmm.
Judeo values.
Right.
And it's very clear in this culture, at least, that Christian Judeo values are not respected. In fact, they're trying to throw it out the window. And so, if you have these Republican candidates that have, sure, they have these values, but they don't have that foundation of that ultimate authority in their lives, they could
Mm-hmm.
potentially be easily swayed. Um, Money is a big motivator, I am learning, and they can definitely be taken in by money. They can definitely be taken in by corruption. So I think the biblical values that you talked about is really important. But I want to ask you a little bit about local politics. We've had a discussion with another guest who's really passionate about local politics, and I think you have a lot of people like on the left and the right that are like, oh, I'll vote for the president, right? I'll vote for the big
Yes.
election, the national election.
Yes.
But for some reason, local politics kind of falls on the wayside. Can you just talk to us about specifically why it's important to vote in local politics? Because I think that's a point that is really getting lost, and something that I'm trying to bring a little bit of steam under.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of what I said earlier about the way that you vote and who is in power locally are the people that are going to be affecting your community and the people around you. I think that we see now, especially in Charlotte with the Pride Festival that just happened and
Mhm.
all of that. I mean, you literally only have to go on Instagram for maybe 5 seconds to see an image of that, and just it makes you want to throw up. It's seriously. And I think that knowing that the way that you vote and whether or not you do vote puts those people where they're going to end up being. And so I think, especially with kids in schools, this is the biggest one that I think people locally are going to start to wake up and realize they need to get involved in. Kids in schools and school boards, and who's in charge of the curriculum and who's in charge of what goes in the libraries and
Mhm.
all of that. I
Yeah.
think that's a really easy one to kind of get people fired up about, because regardless of whether or not you're interested in politics, you're definitely interested in your own kids and what they're learning and what they're being taught. So, I mean, I think that even just from that viewpoint, it's super important to get involved locally. And then really on a more political side of things, like with your governor and mayor and everything, I think COVID is a super easy example to bring up, and just how every single state had different things going on as far as masks and vaccines. And you saw the craziness in New York. And those are the people that decide that and decide what freedoms you have. And even if you don't care about politics, I mean, you want to be able to go to the grocery store without a mask on. Here's who, you need to vote for. And so, yeah, I think it's super important. And I think I do have hope because I see people kind of rising up, especially in my area, to vote locally and get involved.
So do you feel like it's doing well, where you feel like there's a bit more of a local movement starting to happen, at least in your area? Obviously, you can't speak to the rest of the United States. That's
Sure.
far too broad. But you feel like Republicans are like, yeah, I really do want to vote, or Christians are like, yeah, I really do want to vote. Do you think, and just be honest, do you think that's doing well, or do you think it's kind of like, we're working on it, but it's not quite there yet?
I mean, I think, again, to talk about schools, I think I've never seen such a widespread, I don't want to say movement, but it's interesting to see videos of parents talking at these school board meetings, and you don't know whether they're Republican or Democrat. You don't know what they believe in. You don't know what they stand for, but they're saying, I don't want you to teach this to my kids. I don't want my kids to get sexual education in kindergarten, and so I think that's what we need, is not necessarily a party movement, like a party affiliated movement, but just a movement of people that are passionate about, especially like parents that are passionate about their kids and their freedom to teach them. And so I think that that's something cool that I've started to see, is, these videos and these people that you don't know which party they're for, but you know that they're fighting for the right things.
So more of a citizen involvement, really.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think Turning Point USA would probably be willing to take. You don't have to go to a church to come and get involved. Like, they're happy to get you involved in any capacity, no matter your affiliation there. I'm curious though, how does Turning Point USA deal when it comes to, we'll say that maybe there were some biblical values that are split? I think a pretty common one that you hear is, we'll say the Republican Party is usually anti-abortion. So that's a pretty big one there. They're anti-abortion. So morally, as Christians, you should be leaning that way. But then we'll say on the Democrat side of things, they might have some policies that are really trying to take care of homeless people, women's, orphans, something else that the Bible calls for. Now, how they go about it is a different story. But if somebody's looking at those on just moral face value, how does Turning Point USA keep people informed and I mean, I guess in general, you would just have to inform them of both, right? And let the person make up their mind.
Right. And I can't speak for Turning Point USA, obviously, but I know that just from our experience locally in informing people on the issues that are pertinent to them and that they will see more in the coming years. And not necessarily, like I think we were saying, not necessarily Republican versus Democrat. Even on a ballot, when we have one or two Republicans that you're choosing between, or, one or two Democrats, you basically have to do your research on each individual person and each individual policy. And I think that it's super important that we understand that, yes, we are voting people, but we're also voting. Can you hear me?
I got you.
Okay. That you're not only just voting the person, you're voting in the policies. And so I don't see it as, I know a lot of people in my area that are registered independents, and so they will vote for either or both. And I don't see that as a big issue, because at the end of the day, having Republicans in power is not the biggest issue. It's having God in power and having God be the number one ruling institution in our country. And so whether that means voting in a Democrat or voting in a Republican, I don't think that we should play those party politics games.
Yeah,
Here's an argument that I think Jordan and I have both heard before, is that, well, God is already in power, and God is sovereign, all powerful. Why does he need our help?
I don't think he needs our help, but I think that we as Christians, I mean, we're called to be courageous. We're called to, I mean, if you are a believing Christian and you align with the Bible's values, you can't help but get involved because you see that God is being, I mean, I don't know what the right word is. I can't, like, criminalized. I mean, you see, like, I don't know if you guys saw this. Addison Rae had the bikini on with, like,
yeah, I did see that.
No, I didn't see this. So what happened?
It's good. You don't need to see it. You don't need to see it.
I'm not going to go look for it.
But my point is that Christianity is being attacked more so than I think any other religion in this country. Because if anyone had done that to Mormonism or Catholicism, I think there would be a rise in arms of people that would be really upset about it, or they wouldn't allow it on social media platforms. So I just think that Christianity is being severely attacked. And so as a believer, you can't sit by. There's no gray area anymore. It's basically you're either for God or against God, and that's a really hard thing to understand. But I think that a lot of people need to take it that seriously.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we're starting to see a rise is because I think Christians have been very comfortable here in America. I think the way Christianity is done in America is vastly different from other countries. We really don't overall, and there's some disagreement on this amongst Christians. So if you disagree, that would be totally fine. But we're not. I would say up until probably a couple years ago, I wouldn't say there's been a deep amount of persecution. I think we're slowly getting there. I think it's coming in a different form. I think it's coming from the government, but we're not persecuted quite in the same way. We definitely live more comfortably. We worship very openly, and so I think there's kind of this feeling of invincibility of like, we're not going to be touched. We're fine.
Right.
And then COVID kind of hit, and then they're like, wait, they're shutting down our church. They're telling us what to do. And so, pastors, they took different stances on it. And I just want to acknowledge that these pastors have a hard decision to make for sure regarding what they do. But I think for a lot of people, that was kind of a little bit of a wake up call. It's like, wait, the government could legit come after us, and that this could turn into a socialist country if we're not careful. And I think, in other countries where there is persecution, that God does flourish. And so I believe that, no matter what happens with America, there's going to be strong believers. But all of that to say, I feel like the middle ground kind of, there is, like you said, there's no gray area anymore, where one of the things I said in 2020, I was like, we're going to watch the cultural Christians fall away from the true believers, and it's going to become really evident. And I was right, sadly, that I've watched that happen over the past 2 years. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest changes I've seen in the last couple of years, where the climate's gotten a little bit tense overall.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a tension between the Christians that are standing up and the churches that are standing up and the ones that aren't, because it's so difficult. Like you said, I mean, you have to have so much courage in order to stand up and believe what you believe and profess that, especially in today's climate. Today's climate is particularly heated towards Christians already. So, but like you said, I mean, I think especially during Trump, when Trump was president, we got to experience kind of the cushy life. Like, we didn't really have to think about much. There wasn't a whole lot that we had to get involved in because he basically fought everything for us. But you see now how even locally we have to really struggle against the powers that be that don't align with what we believe in. Yeah.
Yeah. And, and on an individual level, and I don't know if people like realize this when, you're online and you're fighting against transgenderism online, you're fighting against abortion online. But I think the thing that we forget as believers is that each of these cases, this overall idea of transgenderism or abortion or what have you, there are individuals being impacted by it. And
Mhm.
there's an opportunity for the gospel. Um, and I was listening to an interview about a woman that became transgender and then she came to Christ, which was a really powerful story where we might have these points, about transgenderism. And I'm very strong about transgenderism because I firmly believe it is body mutilation and their lives will never be the same once they do that. You can't grow back breasts. You can't change the private area once you've done all your work to it. But there's real people that are going to be hurt by this, and there's an opportunity in their pain, whether it's them deciding I should get an abortion because I can't afford this child, or because my boyfriend is pressuring me to, that there's an opportunity for the gospel in these situations, and we can
Yeah,
never lose sight of that. And I'm sure that's something that's definitely on the forefront of your mind as well, as like the gospel matters because that's where the truth lies, right?
that's right. Yeah. And we've seen it save so many people. I mean, just across the country, there's so many amazing stories that, of course, Instagram wouldn't push to the top of your feed. But, they're definitely there to be found of just people that horrible things have happened to them, like that transgender story you were talking about, but using it for the glory of God and using it to speak to other people on the issues that they struggle with. I think that I watched the Daily Wire show, What is a Woman? Um, what an excellent, excellent documentary. Oh my goodness. But I
Yeah.
think the person, Scott Nugent, who was on the documentary, who interviewed, I think that people like that are just so incredible and so courageous because they're speaking up and they have gone through something absolutely traumatic and awful and something that no one in this country would wish on them if they knew the truth.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
they have the
That's so
courage to
true.
speak up and help other people in that situation.
Yeah. And you hit on something important. If they knew the truth, um, that's the key. Where, and I think Connor and I talk about it a little bit, where I think there are some people on the left that genuinely think that they're doing the right thing,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
They really think that, if we let this child become a boy, even though they're a girl, or vice versa, that this is really going to help them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. It destroys their lives. And so I think, if anything, like that's the important thing, is getting the truth out, the dirty truth that
Mhm.
no one really wants to look at. No one wants to look at the truth about abortion. People don't want to look at the
Yeah.
truth of transgenderism and how it harms children, and the sexual perversion that goes on, like even in our own city, Lauren. And
Mhm.
I think I showed Connor of this child pole dancing
Yeah.
with a sex
Yep.
worker.
Yep.
um, I hope that her account gets taken down because I think that qualifies as some level of child abuse,
Mhm.
especially just given the nature of the event and also the provocative and inappropriate clothing and
Yes.
actions that she was doing.
Yes.
It just doesn't make sense to me that that was allowed as a parade or an event when
I
you
know.
can't take a kid into a strip club.
I know.
Like,
Yeah.
you just can't. So, but I mean, this stuff is not, they're not even being, I guess, coy about it. They're just, it's in your face. It's not, they're not
Blatant.
trying to do it behind
Yeah.
closed doors. They are just bringing it out and they're just like, look what we're going to do. And it just,
Yeah.
it reminds me of some of the old, like biblical, like Old Testament cities, some of the ones that God ended up destroying when he was,
Yes.
a bit more directly involved, we'll say. And just the way that the cities became proud of their sinful lifestyle,
Yeah.
and just kind of rubbed it in the face of everybody. And it feels like that's the route that part of this country has decided to go, is just anti-God.
Yep. And I will say, I think there's two distinct almost parties within that. There's the people that are pushing it and being the loudest and being the being the allies. But then there's also the people that are kind of just swept along with it, and like you were saying, Jordan, just don't know the truth. I mean, if you think about the left, there's such impressive wordplay. I love doing research on words and the words they use. And I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, the
Oh gosh.
reproductive women's health care, minor attracted persons, maps. Like, there's just so much wordplay that they use to trick you, and kind of bring you into it slowly so that you don't see the truth of it. And then by the time you do, you're so emotionally involved that it becomes your identity. And then anything against it is taboo, and you just can't listen to any arguments. And so it makes me really sad. But I mean, it makes sense when you think of it that way, for those people to kind of get swept along and just not even understand what they're getting involved in.
Yeah. No, I think you've brought up a very good point about, especially with I think the left does a really good job with wordplay. You're absolutely right. Like the euphemisms, I would say, that they use. They do an incredibly good job, and then they kind of trap you a little
Right.
bit. And say, now if you try to leave, well, these are all the names that you're going to be called if you leave, if you decide that you're not going to be for abortion anymore, or you're not going to be for transgenderism. And I think sometimes, because they use names like transphobic, or you're racist, or I'm trying to think of another one, homophobic, keep going, that these are really nasty names. And I know that they get thrown around where it's very desensitizing. You're like, oh, I'm transphobic. Oh, what's new?
Yeah.
But
Right.
these are really kind of nasty things that they call you, and you're just like, no, and they don't understand the words that they're using either. And I don't know, are you a big reader at all?
Yes, extremely.
Okay, so then you understand words, and it probably bothers you a little bit, where you're like, this is not at all what this word means. They are
Yeah.
completely twisting it. And they get away with it, though. Somehow they get away with it. And not a lot of people call them out for it. The right tries to, but we got to find a better strategy. I don't know. It's also hard to have an argument with a side that can't agree on what words mean, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, because the foundation of an argument is the terms you use, right?
Right, like that's what you're taught in an argument. At least when I was taught debate, it's like you have to define the term. And if we literally cannot define as a country what a woman is, like, what is a woman?
Yes.
It's pathetic. We're in trouble. We're in massive trouble that we can't agree on this. It should be easy, but we can't.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that they do such a good job redefining words or stringing them together in such a way, and then they overuse them to the point that they completely dilute it, and now nobody cares, because it's just for any little thing. I feel like it used to be, if you were phobic something, you're either scared of those people irrationally, you have an irrational fear of people like that, or you outright hate them. And now it's just, if you disagree with it, but you just leave, you're fine leaving them alone. You're not trying to infringe on their lifestyle and their rights. You just, I will say, for transgender, we just want to keep the kids out of it, because they're too young to be making that decision. Like, you can't buy cough syrup at the store, but you can go
you can
go get hormones.
Everything about it. Right.
Doesn't make sense. But I don't know. It is funny to me how much they dilute it. It's just like, racist should be a very specific word for a very specific people, which in my lifetime, I think I've only met a small handful. I could probably count them on one hand, that just did not like people based on their skin color or their nationality. And now it could be anybody.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody that just, it leans one way or another towards something. And even if it's something more of a prejudice tendency, and it's probably a prejudice tendency that's based on just a lack of experience, that makes you a racist.
Right. And I think that is one of the reasons that social media can become so toxic, and such a place of, oh my goodness, just such spreading of lies like that, because it's so easy to throw those terms at someone when you don't see their face, and you don't know their name, and you don't know who they are as a person, and just label them as something that, like you were saying, Jordan, is so serious. I mean, you shouldn't just throw those terms around. And yeah, I do think it's interesting that, I mean, their belief is pro-choice, but I mean, we know what the word choice means, and it's not what that means.
Somebody in that event doesn't have a choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
like that's why I specifically started saying and I ended up having the same problem with the phrasing of pro-life, because like pro-life, in what are you applying it to? Culturally, we know it means abortion, but what else could it mean? It could mean death sentence. You could basically be anti-death sentence by saying you're pro-life. And there's a couple other situations where it would come up. So just like, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more specific. I'm going to say I am anti-abortion. You are pro-abortion.
right.
And it's just needing to be more specific with our words and being careful of the definitions to not use them in such a loose fashion that it's leaving it up for interpretation. Because nowadays, if the left says somebody's racist, you're like, are they really racist? Like, I don't know. I'm gonna have to look, and they might actually be a legitimate racist. But how would you know? Because somebody that I mean, they had the study saying that babies were inherently racist because they're taking like white babies and then bringing them and showing them to somebody that's black, and the baby reacts in a negative way. And it's like, well, has the baby seen somebody like that? This is just, it's a non-exposure. And I think it would surprise somebody if they lived in a world all the time and then they all of a sudden see somebody different. It's kind of odd in America because here's three of us. None of us look similar at all. We are from the same country. You go to other countries and a lot of people look the same. I had a gentleman that I worked with years ago, and they did traveling. They traveled with a kids baseball team, and they took the baseball team went to Japan to go play. One of the coaches was like a 6'6" black guy walking around Japan, and they do not see very many black people out there. So everybody was just parting the Red Seas around him while he walked. He's like, on one hand, he said, he's like, it felt slightly offended, but then on the other hand, he enjoyed the space and just the sense that everybody kind of moved around. But then other people were just really intrigued to meet him and wanted to take pictures. And yeah, that's
so funny.
I think from what I know of the Asian countries, especially more so Japan, is that they might be more on the racist side, but I think it's a non-exposure type of thing. So to label them as a racist country I don't think it's completely accurate, because they're just not exposed to it. Versus somebody who believes, we'll say we've had like the Ku Klux Klan and everything is just like, white's the best, this is the most powerful, the smartest, the best, and everybody else is not even on that same level. Now that, for me, that is what the word racist is reserved for.
Yes.
And I think that's entirely, I think we have to be more purposeful with our words, and social media and the way culture has always come up with new slang terms. It just keeps developing. I think we were talking recently about what is it, Latinx or Latinx?
Oh
gosh,
it.
Oh gosh, yeah.
I think they tried to do the same thing with the Koreans and do like, I don't know what it was, like Korean X, Asian X. It's just like, oh no,
yeah, they all have gendered.
It really hurts.
Language.
Oh gosh.
But I think maybe like Lauren, you can definitely. I mean, obviously, we want you to weigh in on this, so please. But like, a lot of people spend a majority of their time on social media, right? And so you're a big reader, so you probably like to read a lot, and you're exposed to books, you're exposed to different ways of writing. But if you're always on social media, and that's not only is that the only place you get information from, but that's the way that they speak. There's a certain way that you do social media text that's different from the way that you would read an old book or even read a new book. So I feel like that kind of plays into people not having any sort of like respect for words or any sort of respect for the English language whatsoever.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, my favorite kind of books to read are classics. And if you go back and read a Shakespeare or a Charlotte Bronte, I mean, they're very intentional about the language that they use. And it's a very well-structured, very well worded argument or sentence, whatever it is you're reading. And you flip that and go onto social media, and it's such emotional language. It's almost it's almost just, yeah, it's very emotional, very removed from reality. A lot of the arguments that you see. And I think it is easy to get that way because, like we said earlier, I mean, you're by yourself in a room and you're not looking at the people that you're replying to or that you're tagging in the post or whatever. And it seems strange that now being labeled a racist or being labeled transphobic is kind of a badge of honor. Like, yeah, I've pushed against a little bit, and I've been called names. So I just think it's definitely weird to go from reading a classic and see all those words very carefully chosen, and then go on my phone to have all of these just nasty comments. To everyone, they're not very selective on who they label racist or transphobic. But I definitely think it's crazy. It's a crazy world we live in.
I just feel like people, like what you said, it's well structured, and it's well structured because they actually think.
Right. Right.
Like, do we have a generation of people that don't think anymore? They don't know how to think. That's kind of the problem. That's why it gets so easy to get so swept up in all these different ideas and ideologies, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Emotional arguments that you feel like are your identity. And so whatever you can do to, if you have to throw words at somebody or just kind of shut them down as a person instead of actually responding to the arguments, I think that's what a lot of people resort to.
Yeah, emotional arguments, and then a proclivity towards tribalism, where you just kind of pick a group or a party and you just stick with it no matter what, and you just go with it. And I don't know. I'm curious. I think Jordan, we've probably talked about it, but Lauren, have you ever experienced a point in your life, probably when you were a bit younger, where you just like anything somebody said? I think for me, it was like pastors and teachers, and eventually parents, where it was like anything they said, I was like, I internalize it as like, this is right, this is good, I'm going to follow this instruction. And I didn't set up myself questioning if it really was as good as I thought.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a dangerous path to lead them. But I'm curious if you've ever had that experience where there was somebody or a group that you just kind of followed and did what they said, and then one day you just kind of had that experience where your mind just kind of awakens. You're like, yeah, I don't know if I really agree with this.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully I was raised, like I said, in a Christian conservative house, so I was raised on the right side of history. And so, but I definitely reached a point where a lot of my friends, like I had a very close friend who believed something extremely different than I did, and we were able to be friends up until that point, but he just basically said, like, here's what I believe, and we can't continue to be in relationship if we agree on these core values and core beliefs. And I think that really struck me as a time in my life where I had to reevaluate. I think when you're going to lose something, or when there's stakes in the game, basically, it makes you kind of reevaluate what direction you're going in and what you really do, what your core values and beliefs really are. And so that was around the year 2020, and I basically just did my own research and really dove into all this political craziness, to try and figure out what I believed. And I do agree with my parents, and thankfully I align with the conservative side. But I think that that's a step that a lot of people kind of miss, is doing your own research. And like you said, basically just, what do I believe? I mean, I'm not just going to take the word of people that are around me. I have to figure it out for myself. I think that a lot of even people on our side, like on Republican conservative side, are missing that, and that's why maybe it's not such a passion for them.
Yeah. And Lauren, how old are you?
I'm 21.
You're 21 years old. And I think it's really encouraging, because that's young in the grand scheme of things. You know what I'm saying? It's really awesome to see young thinkers that really want to make a difference in our community. And I want to encourage our listeners too that any involvement is not small. Some people have this feeling that local involvement is not as important as being in the Senate, or being in the House of Representatives, or being in an administration for the presidency. The local part is, to a certain extent, I say it's key. And so we're really encouraged by you. And at Resident Skeptics, I think this is a great note to end on, is that we believe, like, you got to do your own research. You got to know what you stand for. Okay, you're a Republican. Why? Tell us why.
Right.
Know your arguments in and out, do your own research. And so it's really encouraging for us to see that, like, yes, you grew up. It's encouraging to know that there's people that grew up in a strong foundational household. Like, that's really important. But that you learned how to think for yourself and make that decision yourself, to follow in Christian ways, and also stand up for your community in a conservative way as well. So we're just so grateful to have you. Is there anything that you can just tell us about Turning Point Faith? Anything that you can tell us about how people can get involved? If you guys have anything going on that we can kind of, I guess, link in our bio, is there anything that we can do there?
Yeah, so we have an Instagram account. That's the easiest way to get in touch with us, or to kind of keep up to date on all the comings and goings and the events. And that's TPUSA Faith FH. So you can find us on there, and all of our events are posted on there as well. Our next event will be September 6th with, like I said, David Harris Jr. And all that information is on the Instagram, so you should definitely come out for that.
Perfect. I almost called you a different person. That sounds so weird. Lauren, thank you so much. And the reason why I almost called you a different guest, because you guys are doing really similar things, but in two different spaces. So it's awesome to see. But Lauren, we're so happy that you came here and talked to us. We hope to have you back on, maybe in person.
In person, for sure.
Yeah, get in person.
Yes, when schedules align. But we'll go ahead and link her information in our podcast description or our YouTube subscription. Tune back in next time for more awesome guests. You're not going to want to miss out. They're pretty dang cool people. We'll see you next time.